At exactly 2:17 a.m., Maxwell Carter's phone lit up in the darkness of his bedroom, the kind of silence that feels heavier when something interrupts it. And for a brief second, he just stared at the screen without touching it, as if some instinct told him to wait, to be careful. But eventually curiosity won, and he reached for it, expecting the usual late-night notification or a wrong number. Except this wasn't either of those, because there was no name attached, no contact photo, no previous conversation, just a single message sitting there as if it had always been waiting for him. 6 words that didn't explain themselves and didn't need to. Don't open the door tomorrow morning. And the strange thing wasn't just the message, it was how specific it felt, how deliberate, like it wasn't sent to just anyone. It was sent to him. And for a moment, just a moment, Maxwell felt something he couldn't quite explain. Not fear exactly, but a quiet hesitation, the kind that makes you question. Something you would normally ignore. And yet he did what most people would do, what you would probably do. He looked at it, frowned slightly, and dismissed it as nothing important. Maybe a prank, maybe a mistake, maybe someone sending the wrong message to the wrong person. And without thinking twice, he placed his phone back on the nightstand, turned over, and went back to sleep, unaware that this simple decision, this small act of ignoring something that felt out of place, would become the last normal choice he would make. Because by the time the sun rose and the morning arrived, everything about his life, everything he thought he understood, everything he believed was predictable and within his control, had already begun to change in a way no one around him could have anticipated, and certainly not in a way he could ever undo. And when investigators would later go through every detail, every second leading up to what happened next, they would all come back to this exact moment. This exact message, asking the same question over and over again. Why was he warned? And more importantly, who was trying to stop him? Because messages like that don't appear without reason, and they don't arrive without intention, and the truth behind it would turn out to be far more personal than anyone expected, far closer to him than anyone could have imagined. But at 2:17 a.m., lying in that quiet room, Maxwell Carter had no way of knowing that the message he chose to ignore wasn't just a warning. It was the only chance he had to prevent what was coming next, and by morning, that chance would be gone, completely and permanently, leaving behind only questions, fragments of evidence, and a story that would leave even the most experienced investigators unsettled. Because what happened to Maxwell Carter didn't begin with a crime. It began with a choice, a simple decision that seemed insignificant at the time. The kind people make every single day without ever thinking about the consequences. And yet in this case, that one decision would become the defining moment of everything that followed, raising a question that still lingers long after the events themselves have been examined and re-examined. If you were in his position, if your phone lit up in the middle of the night with a message that made no sense but felt strangely directed at you, would you have ignored it too? Or would you have done something differently? And more importantly, would it have made any difference at all? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next, what unfolded over the following hours, would not only change Maxwell Carter's life, it would challenge the very idea of coincidence, timing, and whether some warnings are meant to be understood or simply followed without question. And as the investigation would later reveal, the message was only the beginning. Not the explanation, not the answer, but the first piece of something far more complex, something that would only start to make sense when it was already too late to change anything at all. And that is what makes this story so difficult to ignore, because it doesn't rely on something distant or impossible. It begins with something simple, something familiar, something that could happen to anyone. A phone lighting up in the middle of the night, a message that doesn't belong, and a decision to treat it as nothing more than a mistake. A moment that passes quickly, easily forgotten, until it becomes the one moment everything traces back to, the one detail that refuses to fade, the one choice that separates what could have happened from what actually did. And as we follow the sequence of events that led from that message to the outcome no one expected, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't random, it wasn't accidental, and it wasn't meaningless. It was a warning, one that Maxwell Carter received, read, and ultimately chose to ignore, and that choice would define everything that came after, including the question that still remains unanswered. Who sent the message? And how did they know exactly what was going to happen the next morning? Maxwell Carter was not the kind of man anyone would expect to become the center of a mystery like this. And that is exactly what makes his story so unsettling. Because nothing about his life suggested anything unusual, nothing hinted at the kind of events that would later unfold. He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where routines were predictable and days blended into one another. The kind of place where people waved to each other in passing, but rarely asked deeper questions. Where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. And yet it was in that very setting, in that calm and familiar environment, that something began to shift, something that would go unnoticed at first, overlooked in the same way Maxwell overlooked that message. And as investigators would later piece together the timeline, they realized that the message wasn't just strange, it was precise. It arrived at a specific time, with a specific instruction directed at a man whose life followed a pattern so consistent that any disruption to it stood out immediately, which raises the first question that refuses to go away. Who sent the message? Because this wasn't random, it wasn't sent in error, it was intentional, directed, and somehow connected to what would happen next. And then there is the second question, one that becomes even more difficult to answer the deeper you go into the details. What did they know? Because the message didn't just warn Maxwell, it predicted something specific enough to mention the door, something that suggests prior knowledge of an event that had not yet happened. And that leads to the third question, the one that lingers long after everything else has been examined. Could this have been prevented? Because if Maxwell had taken the message seriously, if he had paused just a little longer, questioned it just a little more, or simply chosen not to open that door the next morning, would the outcome have been different? Or was everything that followed already set into motion long before that message ever appeared on his phone? And that is what makes this more than just a story about a message. It is a story about a decision, a moment so small it almost feels insignificant, the kind of moment most people would brush aside without a second thought. And yet in this case, that moment became the turning point, the line between what could have happened and what actually did. And as we move forward, every detail, every discovery, every piece of evidence will continue to circle back to that single decision. Because in the end, it wasn't just the message that mattered, it was what Maxwell Carter chose to do with it. And the consequences that followed would reveal just how much can change when a warning is ignored, especially one that seems to know more than it should. To understand what happened to Maxwell Carter, you have to begin with the version of him that existed before that message ever appeared, because by all accounts, he was the kind of man most people would describe as steady, predictable, and quietly dependable. Someone in his mid-40s who had built a life around structure and routine, working as an insurance analyst in a job that rewarded attention to detail and careful thinking, the kind of work that requires you to anticipate risk, measure outcomes, and avoid unnecessary surprises. And in many ways, that mindset defined how Maxwell lived his life outside of work as well. He woke up at the same time each morning, followed the same sequence of small habits without deviation, and kept his world controlled and manageable, not out of fear, but out of preference. Because for him, consistency meant stability, and stability meant peace. Or at least that is what it looked like from the outside. But beneath that routine, there were fractures that had started to form, quiet changes that didn't announce themselves, but were noticed by those paying close attention. Because not long before the message, Maxwell's life had shifted in ways that were easy to overlook, but difficult to ignore once you connected them. He had recently gone through a divorce that ended not with conflict, but with distance, the kind of separation where nothing dramatic happens, yet everything changes, leaving behind a silence that fills the spaces where conversation used to be. And around the same time, his relationship with his younger brother had broken down in a way no one fully understood, a disagreement that was never openly explained, only hinted at in fragments. And since then, Maxwell had become more withdrawn, keeping interactions brief, avoiding unnecessary conversations, and spending more time alone than he used to. And while none of this seemed alarming on its own, it began to take on a different meaning when placed alongside something else, something that happened just weeks before the message arrived. A phone call that Maxwell received late one evening. A call he answered, listened to in silence, and then ended without explanation. And when asked about it later by a neighbor who happened to notice his reaction, Maxwell simply dismissed it, saying it was nothing important, yet his tone suggested otherwise, and from that point on, there were subtle differences in his behavior, small changes that would only stand out. In hindsight, moments where he seemed distracted, where his attention drifted, where his usual certainty appeared slightly unsettled, and one neighbor would later recall saying, almost casually, that Maxwell had been different lately, not in a way that raised immediate concern, but enough to be remembered once everything else came to light. And these details, insignificant on their own, begin to form a pattern when viewed together, a pattern that suggests the message at 2:17 a.m. was not the beginning of the story, but a continuation of something that had already started, something that Maxwell may have been aware of, or at the very least, something he chose not to fully confront. And that brings us to a moment that investigators would later identify as critical, a moment that sits just outside the visible timeline. Easy to miss unless you know where to look, because 3 days before that message appeared on his phone, something happened, something Maxwell Carter experienced, something he chose not to share with anyone, not with his neighbors, not with his coworkers, not even with the few people who still had access to his life. And whatever it was, whatever took place in those 3 days, it would quietly connect everything that followed, raising a question that would only become clearer as the story unfolded. Why did he keep it to himself? And more importantly, what exactly happened during that time that he never told anyone? The night the message arrived did not begin any differently from the nights that came before it. And that is part of what makes the sequence so difficult to accept, because there was no obvious trigger, no clear disruption, nothing that would have prepared Maxwell Carter for what was about to happen. He followed his usual routine, finished his evening, and settled into the quiet of his home as he always did, the kind of silence that feels familiar rather than empty. And when his phone vibrated at 2:17 a.m., it cut through that silence in a way that immediately drew his attention, not because late-night notifications were unusual, but because something about this one felt different. And when he reached for the device and saw the message on the screen, he paused longer than he normally would have, reading it once, then again, as if expecting it to change or reveal something more, but it didn't. It remained exactly the same, direct and unexplained. Don't open the door tomorrow morning. And in that moment, there was a choice to be made, not a dramatic one, not something that felt urgent or life-altering, but a quiet internal decision about whether to take it seriously or dismiss it as nothing. And like most people in that situation, Maxwell chose the simplest explanation. He told himself it was a mistake, a random message sent to the wrong number, and with that reasoning, he placed the phone down and allowed the moment to pass, convincing himself that it did not deserve any further attention, and eventually, he went back to sleep, leaving the message behind without realizing that it had already begun to shape what would happen next. And when morning came, everything appeared exactly as it always had. The same light through the window, the same sequence of actions, the same predictable rhythm that had defined his life for years. He moved through his routine without interruption, preparing for the day ahead. And for a while, there was nothing to suggest that anything had changed. But as he approached the front door, something subtle shifted, not in the environment itself, but in his awareness of it. Because for a brief moment, the message returned to his mind, not as a clear warning, but as a faint reminder, enough to make him hesitate, enough to make him pause with his hand on the door, standing there in silence as if weighing a decision that no longer felt entirely insignificant. And for a few seconds, he considered the possibility that it might mean something, that perhaps it was worth taking seriously. But just as quickly, that thought was replaced by logic, by the same reasoning that had guided him the night before, and with that, he turned the handle and opened the door, stepping outside into what appeared to be an ordinary morning. And at first, nothing happened. There was no immediate consequence, no visible sign that anything was wrong, just the quiet of the neighborhood and the familiar stillness of the early hour. And for a moment, it seemed as though the message had been exactly what he assumed it was, nothing more than a meaningless interruption. But as Maxwell took a few steps forward, that sense of normalcy began to shift. Slowly and almost imperceptibly, he noticed something out of place. His neighbor's front door was slightly open, not wide, not enough to immediately cause alarm, but enough to stand out in a neighborhood where doors were usually closed and routines were consistent. And as he looked around, he realized there was an unfamiliar car parked along the curb, a vehicle he did not recognize, positioned in a way that suggested it had been there for some time. And then there was the silence, not the usual quiet of the morning, but something deeper, something that felt incomplete, as if the environment itself was missing something it should have had. And while none of these details confirmed that anything was wrong, together they created a feeling that was difficult to ignore, a growing sense that the situation was not as ordinary as it first appeared. And as Maxwell stood there, trying to process what he was seeing, he heard something, a faint sound coming from inside the neighbor's house, subtle enough to question, but distinct enough to notice, and without fully understanding why, he found himself moving toward it, drawn not by certainty, but by the need to resolve the unease that had started to build. And as he approached the open door and looked inside, his attention was immediately pulled to something on the floor, a phone lying just inside the entryway, its screen illuminated, casting a soft light in the otherwise quiet space. And for a moment, he hesitated, aware that crossing that threshold would change the situation in a way he could not reverse. But the need for answers outweighed that hesitation, and he stepped closer, reached down, and picked up the device, bringing it into view as the screen displayed a message thread that looked familiar in a way he could not immediately explain. And as he focused on the details, as he read what was written there, as he recognized the time, the words, the structure of the message itself, everything began to shift at once, because what he saw on that screen was not just unexpected, it was impossible to dismiss. And in that moment, standing in a place he had no reason to be, holding a phone that should not have been there, Maxwell Carter realized that the message he had ignored was not random. It was connected, directly and unmistakably, to what was unfolding around him, and what he saw on that screen changed everything. What happened after Maxwell Carter picked up that phone is where the story shifts from something unusual into something investigators could no longer explain through normal reasoning. Because the moment he saw the message on that screen, identical in wording, identical in timing, sent at exactly 2:17 a.m., the same message he had received hours earlier, it established a connection that could not be ignored. And when authorities were eventually called to the scene, what they found only deepened the confusion. The house quickly became an active investigation site. The area was secured, and every detail inside was treated as potential evidence. But the most important piece remained that phone, because it held a message that should not have existed in two places at once, and more importantly, it was linked to Maxwell Carter in a way no one could immediately explain. The number that sent the message did not appear in any conventional database, yet traces of its activity pointed back toward him, creating a situation where he was no longer just a witness to something unusual, but a central figure in a case that was beginning to attract attention beyond the neighborhood. And as the story reached local media, it was framed as a disappearance, a situation involving unexplained circumstances, a missing timeline, and a man whose account raised more questions than answers. Headlines began to circulate. Speculation followed, and with that came scrutiny, not just from investigators, but from the public, who tried to make sense of a situation that seemed to shift with every new detail. And as the investigation expanded, several possibilities were explored, each one offering a potential explanation that ultimately led nowhere. It was revealed that the neighbor whose house Maxwell had entered had a past that included minor legal trouble, enough to raise suspicion but not enough to explain what had occurred. At the same time, Maxwell's younger brother, who had been absent from his life for some time, reappeared and was questioned extensively, adding another layer of complexity to an already unclear situation. And then there were issues connected to Maxwell's work, a dispute that had taken place months earlier involving a claim that had not been resolved cleanly. Each of these details seemed relevant at first, each one suggested a possible motive or connection, yet none of them fully aligned with the central question. How did that message exist in two places, and why? Did it seem to anticipate an event before it happened? And as investigators attempted to build a timeline, they turned their focus back to Maxwell himself, placing him under increasing scrutiny, conducting interviews that became more pointed with each session, asking the same question in different ways, trying to uncover something he might not have realized he knew. And during one of these interrogations, a question was asked that would later define the tone of the entire investigation. Why? Would someone warn you and you ignore it? And it was a question that did not have a simple answer, because from Maxwell's perspective, there had been no clear reason to take the message seriously, no context, no indication that it was anything more than a mistake. Yet now, in hindsight, that reasoning felt insufficient, even to him. And as the pressure increased, something began to change in his responses, subtle at first, but noticeable enough to raise concern. He became less certain about the sequence of events, less confident in his recollection, and at one point, he made a statement that investigators could not easily dismiss. He claimed that he had seen the cinder before, not clearly, not in a way he could fully describe, but in fragments, as if the memory existed just outside his ability to recall it completely. And when pressed for details, he struggled to explain what he meant, which only added to the uncertainty surrounding his role in the situation, because now the investigation was no longer focused solely on external factors. It had turned inward, examining the possibility that the answer might lie within Maxwell Carter himself. And just as investigators began to question whether they were dealing with something psychological rather than physical, something that could be explained through perception rather than evidence, they uncovered a detail that shifted everything once again, a piece of information that did not fit into any existing theory, something that should not have existed at all. And the moment it was discovered, it forced everyone involved to reconsider everything they thought they understood about the case, because it suggested that the connection between Maxwell Carter and that message went far deeper than anyone had imagined, and it raised a new question that would become impossible to ignore. If the message did not come from outside, then where exactly did it come from? And then investigators uncovered something that shouldn't have existed. What investigators uncovered next was not just unexpected. It was the kind of detail that forces you to question every assumption you've made up to that point. Because when they reviewed security footage from a nearby property, footage that had initially been overlooked due to its poor angle and limited visibility, they found something that did not align with the established timeline. Something that placed Maxwell Carter in a position he could not logically have been in, at a time that had already been accounted for. And as they enhanced the footage and analyzed it frame by frame, one detail became impossible to ignore. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the same time the message was sent, the same time Maxwell's phone had lit up beside his bed, there appeared to be a figure outside, standing within range of the property where the phone had later been found. And while the image was not perfectly clear, the outline, the posture, the way the figure moved, all pointed toward a conclusion that investigators were initially hesitant to accept, because it suggested that Maxwell Carter was present in two places at once, inside his home receiving the message, and outside, at that same moment, connected to the act of sending it. And as they dug deeper, looking for anything that could explain this contradiction, they encountered more inconsistencies, small gaps in the timeline that did not match Maxwell's account, moments where his movements could not be fully verified. And while none of this confirmed anything on its own, together it began to form a pattern that could not be easily dismissed. And then came the witness statements, accounts from individuals in the neighborhood who, when questioned again with more specific prompts, recalled seeing someone who looked exactly like Maxwell Carter in the area around the time of the incident, not just similar, but identical in appearance, wearing the same clothes, moving in a way that mirrored his usual behavior. In these accounts, while difficult to verify, aligned too closely with the footage to be ignored, raising a possibility that investigators were reluctant to put into words because it did not fit within any conventional explanation. And so alternative theories were introduced, each one attempting to bring the situation back into a framework that could be understood. Some suggested that Maxwell may have experienced a psychological break, a condition that affected his perception of time and memory. Others considered the possibility of an identity disorder, a scenario in which his actions were carried out without his conscious awareness. But even these explanations failed to account for the physical evidence, the timestamps, the presence of the message in two places, and the consistency of the reports from those who claimed to have seen him. And as the investigation continued, the focus returned once again to Maxwell himself, not as a suspect in the traditional sense, but as someone whose experience of events might hold the key to understanding what had occurred. And during one of the final interviews conducted before the case reached its most critical turning point, Maxwell was shown the footage, the timestamps, the message records, everything that had been gathered up to that moment. And for a long time, he said nothing. He simply looked at the evidence, processing it in silence. until eventually, he spoke in a way that would later be described as both calm and deeply unsettled, and what he said did not attempt to deny what he was seeing. It did not challenge the evidence or offer an alternative explanation. Instead, it acknowledged something that investigators had not yet considered in full, something that reframed the entire situation in a way that made it both clearer and more difficult to accept at the same time. Because in that moment, Maxwell Carter came to a realization that connected everything: the message, the timing, the presence of the phone, the figure in the footage, the accounts from witnesses. All of it pointed toward a single conclusion that he could no longer avoid. And when he finally spoke, it was not as a defense or an explanation, but as an understanding of what had already happened. He looked at the investigators and said, almost quietly, as if the weight of it had just settled in, "I tried to warn myself." And with that statement, the case shifted once again, because it suggested that the message was not sent by someone watching from a distance, not by someone with prior knowledge or hidden intent, but by Maxwell Carter himself, in a way that no one involved could fully explain. And if that was true, if the warning came from him, then the question was no longer who sent the message, it was how, and more importantly, why it failed to change what happened next. By the time investigators reached what they believed was the end of Maxwell Carter's case, the facts no longer formed a straight line. They formed a pattern, one that repeated itself in ways that were subtle at first but impossible to ignore once seen clearly. Because when the timeline was reconstructed again, this time without assuming a single sequence of events, but instead allowing for overlaps, inconsistencies, and gaps that had previously been dismissed, something unexpected began to emerge. Small details that had seemed unrelated now aligned with one another. Timestamps that appeared isolated began to mirror earlier records, and fragments of evidence that had been set aside due to lack of context started to take on a new meaning, suggesting that what happened to Maxwell Carter was not confined to a single moment, but part of something that extended beyond the visible sequence of events. And as this perspective developed, investigators uncovered archived data linked to Maxwell's phone activity, records that should have been empty, yet contained traces of messages sent at the exact same time, 2:17 a.m., on dates that did not correspond with the known incident, messages that carried the same wording, the same structure, the same warning. And while these records could not be fully verified within the constraints of conventional analysis, their existence introduced a possibility that could not be dismissed outright, that this was not the first time the message had been sent. And if that was the case, then it raised a question that shifted the entire understanding of the situation. Had Maxwell Carter experienced this before? And if so, why did he not remember? And more importantly, why did the outcome remain unchanged? Because if the message was intended to alter a decision, then its repetition suggested that the decision had been made the same way each time, that the warning had been received, read, and ultimately ignored, leading to the same result over and over again. And as unsettling as that idea was, it aligned with the evidence in a way that no other explanation had, creating a scenario in which the message was not a one-time event, but part of a cycle, a loop that reset itself without leaving behind a complete record, only fragments that could be uncovered under the right conditions. And in this context, Maxwell's realization during his final interview took on a different meaning, because if he had tried to warn himself, then the message was not just a reaction to what had already happened. It was an attempt to intervene in something that was already in motion, something that continued despite that attempt. And as the case reached its conclusion, there was no definitive answer that could resolve every detail, no single explanation that accounted for both the physical evidence and the psychological elements involved, only a pattern that suggested repetition, a sequence that appeared to restart without notice, and a message that remained consistent regardless of how many times it was sent. And in the final report, the case was closed with unresolved factors noted. But among those who had followed the investigation closely, one detail remained at the center of every discussion: the idea that the message was still active in some form, still part of a sequence that had not fully ended. And that possibility became difficult to dismiss entirely when, months later, in a completely different location, under circumstances that bore no direct connection to Maxwell Carter, a phone lit up at exactly 2:17 a.m., displaying a message that had not changed, not in wording, not in timing, not an intent. Don't open the door tomorrow morning. And the person who received it, like Maxwell before them, had no reason to believe it was anything more than a mistake, no context to suggest it should be taken seriously. And as they read it and set their phone aside, making the same quiet decision that had been made before, the pattern continued without interruption, reinforcing a conclusion that remains difficult to accept but even harder to ignore, that some warnings are not meant to be understood, they're meant to be ignored. And it is in that moment, the moment of dismissal, that everything that follows becomes inevitable, not because it cannot be changed, but because it is rarely questioned in time to make a difference. And after everything you've just heard, every detail, every decision, every moment that led Maxwell Carter from a quiet, predictable life into something no one around him could fully explain, the question becomes less about what happened and more about what you would have done in his place. Because at its core, this story doesn't begin with something impossible. It begins with something simple, something familiar. A message appearing at a time when most people wouldn't question it. A warning. That feels vague enough to ignore and strange enough to dismiss. And yet that single moment carries more weight than it appears to. Because it forces a decision. One that seems small at the time, but defines everything that follows. So if your phone lit up at exactly 2:17 a.m. and you saw those same 6 words staring back at you, would you treat it as nothing? Would you turn over and go back to sleep the way Maxwell Carter did? Or would you stop, hesitate, and choose to act differently? And even if you did, even if you decided to stay inside, to avoid the door entirely, would it actually change the outcome? Or would the same sequence find another way to unfold? And that leads to a deeper question, one that lingers long after the details fade. Did Maxwell Carter ever truly have a choice? Or was he always going to make the same decision no matter how many times the warning appeared? Because if the message was part of something repeating, something that continued regardless of awareness, then it suggests that the outcome may not have depended on the message at all, but on something far more difficult to recognize in the moment. And that is what makes this story stay with you. Not the message itself, but the uncertainty of whether it could have been understood in time to make a difference. So now the question is yours to answer. If you received that message, would you ignore it? Or would you stay inside? And more importantly, do you think Maxwell Carter ever had a choice? Subscribe to Unseen Mind Lab for more stories that reveal what the mind tries to hide.